This is a session on power and powerlessness, anti-Semitism in our time. The speakers today received a short paragraph from the ADL, which I'll read you because they're going to relate to it. I won't read all of it. I assume you have it in your materials, is that correct? No? Okay, then I'll read it. For the vast majority of Jewish history, anti-Semitism has plagued a people without military or political power. While finding a single unifying definition of anti-Semitism across space and time can prove elusive, it might be argued that while in earlier times fantasies of Jewish power fueled the persecution of a largely powerless people, anti-Semitism itself may possess somewhat of a different meaning in an age when Jews have a measure of power in the world. While Jews can by no means be described as possessing power in all communities in which they now reside, the notion of responsibility for policy in the State of Israel and its ability to project power and exercise authority complicates the equation of Jewish power and powerlessness. Furthermore, the position of Jews within American society has fundamentally changed even over the past 100 years. Now, I'm told that we have 40 minutes for this discussion. And so I'm going to just introduce our panelists very quickly. On the right-hand side is Professor Moshe Halbertal, Israeli philosopher, professor, and writer. Next to him is Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalon Hartman Institute of North America. And to my right is Dr. Einat Wilf, Baye Foundation adjunct fellow, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and former member of the Knesset. And I'm going to ask, each one of them is going to have up to 10 minutes to speak. I'm going to ask Einat to start.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for providing me with this opportunity. As I was reading the paragraph and was asked to reflect on the question of whether the fact that Jews now have power makes any difference in terms of anti-Semitism, I asked myself a question that I've been asking for quite some time, which is the hatred of Jews, is the rise of anti-Semitism throughout history with the ebb and flow of that phenomenon never disappearing, did it ever have anything to do with the Jews? Is anti-Semitism about the Jews? Is it affected by what the Jews actually do? And my answer, of course, is no. If you look at history, anti-Semitism was never about the rational assessment of Jewish life and Jewish action. Jews were remarkably simultaneously hated for being too wealthy and for being too poor, for being capitalists and for being socialists and communists, for being too different and for being too much like us. So the notion that there is a rational assessment that changes when Jews do things differently is a beautiful illusion that we sometimes hold on to, thinking that it actually matters what we do. But I think if you look throughout history, it's been proven entirely false. So if anti-Semitism at various times talked about Jewish power, Jewish control of the world, still does, regardless of whether Jews actually had that power, the fact that Jews today have more power than they had ever makes no difference. It makes no difference to the actual phenomena of the hatred of the Jews. So the question is, what does make a difference, and where does the fact of Jewish power make a difference? So first, I would argue that to understand the phenomena of the rise of anti-Semitism, we need to ask not what's wrong with those who are being hated, but rather what's wrong with those who are doing the hating. And we will always find the answer there. The rise of hatred of Jews is always indicative of a deep crisis in the society that does the hating. Those are typically not just economic crises, but crises of identities, crises of uncertainty. And especially during periods of uncertainty, you see the rise of hatred of the Jews, whatever name it has at a particular time. And the reason that it rises during moments of crisis is that it provides a certain kind of certainty. There is nothing more certain in this world than that the Jews did it, right? It's worked so well for so long. So it's so useful, and especially at moments of crisis, you hang on to that. It's a certainty. They did it. They're to blame. They control, they're the master puppeteers who are controlling behind the scenes the things that ail your lives. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the crisis that is taking place in the various societies and the various sections of societies where we see the rise of that hatred? What is the crisis of the left? What is the crisis of the right? But there are answers to that, and maybe we can discuss them later, but there's no question that this is where we locate the problem. The issue, of course, is that the Jews no longer want to wait around while societies resolve their crises on their backs. Because it's one thing to say, okay, the problem is with those who are doing the hating. The kind of not so small caveat is that as societies have been acting out and working through these crises, they have historically done it on the back, and sometimes much worse, of the Jews. So this is where Jewish power now makes a difference. It does not make a difference to the actual ebb and flow of Jew hatred. It makes a difference, and I could say it's a small only. It only makes a difference, but it's a huge only. It makes a difference only that the fact that the Jews now have the ability to mitigate the impact of that hatred on their lives, on their very survival. That is the big difference. It's an only, but it's huge. We now can look at the rise of hatred of the Jews and say, you work through your crises, whatever they are. We're not waiting around for you to figure it out as you do it on our backs. We have power to mitigate the impact of your crisis and your hatred as it is manifested in this crisis on us. And this is where it really makes a difference. For a very long time, I asked myself, what would Herzl say or think if he realized that the very act of creating the State of Israel, the very existence of the State of Israel, did not solve anti-Semitism, did not cure the world of that ancient hatred, that in many ways it has transformed itself, become changed into, in many cases, a hatred of the Jewish state. Would he be despondent, having been so hopeful that he has the solution, that he has the cure? And I have come to accept that, mind the pun, this hatred is, so to say, our cross to bear. This is a permanent phenomena of Jewish history. But the very act of being powerful allows us, and this is not a person I typically quote, but Yair Lapid recently said to the Telegraph, it allows us to tell them to shove it. And I thought, okay, that works. And that's it. Not more than that, but certainly not less than that. And that's still something huge. This, and I will end with this does not mean that as people with power, whether in the State of Israel, whether politically in the United States, we don't have a responsibility to exercise that power in a smart and moral way, but we should not confuse the actual fact of having power with the fact that this is the cause and the reason for the rise of the hatred of the Jews. Those are two separate phenomena. Hatred of the Jews never depended on the actual fact of what Jews do, but it doesn't mean that we as Jews don't have a responsibility to do the right thing. Thank you.
Okay. I guess I'm supposed to use this, Yehuda.
Thank you, and thank you to the ADL for both convening this day, as well as for the extraordinary moral leadership that the ADL has been exhibiting in the recent American moment. I'm really happy to be here, and I broadly agree, Einat, with your comments about distinguishing meaningfully between some notion of root causes of anti-Semitism that we can attach to what we do, and simply identifying this as something that's separate from us. And it hasn't simply been non-Jews who have tried to blame Jews for the history of anti-Semitism. It's a long current in Jewish thought of Jewish thinkers who are convinced that in some way there's something that the Jewish people are doing that is inviting this hate upon themselves. But I guess here's what challenges me, and I'm picking up and in some ways responding to your comments. What's challenging is that there's a little bit of a paradox in the last 30, 40 years in the American Jewish community, which has been that in the moment in which the Jewish people have had the most power in our history, and that's in two different arenas, the hard power as exhibited by the State of Israel, and the soft power that is exhibited by the unprecedented degree of affluence, influence, power, and privilege that American Jews wield in this diaspora. The more that American Jews and Israeli Jews both have power, the more anxiety about powerlessness seems to have risen as a dominant ideology of American Jews. And as a result, the anxiety and the concern about anti-Semitism goes up. And what makes me nervous about that, and what I think what should make us all rightly nervous about that, is that power invites a whole set of moral responsibilities that are incredibly profound, and invites us to create all sorts of cushioning and conditioning around the traps that are inherent when you're actually wielding power over others. When you are powerless, you have very few moral responsibilities to the other. Your primary moral responsibility is merely survival. And so paradoxically, powerlessness has its own potential of being a type of moral narcissism. And as a result, this rise of an anxiety about anti-Semitism, simultaneous at the time when Jews are actually exercising power, comes across as an avoidance strategy from actually doing the much harder work of trying to engage how you exercise power. So how do you hold these two things simultaneously in a way that doesn't involve just throwaway terms? Yes, we have to exercise power. We have to exercise power responsibly, and we have to differentiate the exercise of power from root causes of anti-Semitism. In this regard, I personally am struggling right now in this American moment. I feel extremely aware in the past week, especially as America kind of awakens to this story of the alt-right, that maybe the story that I have been telling about myself as an American Jew who has grown up in a context where I have rarely, if ever, felt a sense of anti-Semitism from others, whether the story that I've been telling about the degree of American Jewish comfort and power and privilege, which I feel like come out honestly and I talk about a lot, and I do so precisely to invite American Jews to be reflective about the moral responsibilities that come with their power, I wonder whether I have been, and I think the answer is probably yes, a little bit naive about the prevalence of anti-Semitism in this country and this society that I have not paid attention to. I admit my own naivete about the degree to which I've taken seriously anti-Semitism as a significant force on the left, because we all tend to have blind spots about our own politics, right? We don't like to see anti-Semitism among the people who actually agree with our politics, because it jeopardizes the legitimacy of that position, but also because the more you identify anti-Semitism on the side for which you're advocating, the less you feel responsible morally for the agenda that you're actually pursuing. So I want to just put that as the challenge that I think both of us, all of us, regardless of our politics, whether we come from the left or the right, to become awakened to the possibility that this anti-Semitism virus exists in much more profound ways than we tend to see even in the societies in which we're comfortable. That the fact that it permeates both the far left and the far right indicates, and it's not just because far left and far right eventually converge at being the same, it actually indicates that hateful ideologies can manifest themselves in a variety of political positions without having to be explained on the basis of an actual relationship to those political positions. But I'm incredibly committed and quite anxious about I'm incredibly committed to the concern that a greater sense of sensitivity about anti-Semitism by both right and left, a greater sense of empathy that folks on the right have to have for folks on the left about what they are struggling with and vice versa, that greater sensitivity does not wind up leading to the exonerating by the American Jewish community or by Israelis about the degree of their moral responsibility. And I'll just conclude with this. You know, one of the thinkers in recent Jewish history who was of the worldview that anti-Semitism could be explained in reference to the actions of the Jews was Hannah Arendt. This was in many respects her blind spot. David Nierenberg writes about this in Anti-Judaism, that there's a natural instinct by Jews to look for interpretive frameworks based on their own actions. And the reason she was looking for that interpretive framework was because she was trying to make sure that we were being morally responsible. And I've been thinking about that a lot and kind of and struggling with her own blind spot in seeing what it is that she saw and what it is she didn't what it is she didn't see. At the same time, as much as I'm recognizing the degree to which a lot of us do this, we don't see our own blind spots when it comes to anti-Semitism because they close off our moral imagination towards others. At the same time, I'm also compelled by the other piece of Hannah Arendt's great legacy, which is the banality of evil hypothesis, and the risk that the more you become concerned that anti-Semitism is totally something other than yourself, a discourse of hate that has nothing to do with you, the risk is that you wind up doing the same things, but they're called something else. And so how do we seriously, simultaneously hold these two things together, not as throwaway talking points, but a real commitment on one hand to not allow ourselves to take the blame for anti-Semitism as something toxic and universal, and at the same time really take seriously that, that we too are subject or susceptible to the same types of moral impulses towards others to which we need to hold ourselves responsible.
Moshe.
So thanks, really, it's an honor to be here, and thanks for having me. I want to start with some reflections of what do we mean by Jewish power. And I'm a son of a Holocaust survivor who came from an ultra-Orthodox, Haredi, anti-Zionist background. And what happened for him through the war is that he became a Zionist. And he became a Zionist in the following sense, in which there is a deep understanding that it is upon the Jews to assume political responsibility for their own fate. If you ask me, what is Zionism? It's about that. I was blessed as an Israeli to be of that generation that tried to achieve that in an ongoing struggle. Now, you ask yourself the following thing, and I really want to talk about this issue, and many things that both Einat and Yehuda said resonate with me. What does it mean for us Israelis to live in a condition of ongoing anti-Semitism? One thing I think is very important for us is, first of all, to internalize the fact of power. We are in a position, it's a great achievement, in which we have the means of controlling our own political fate. And it is very dangerous to talk the language of the weak from a position of power. I'm not talking now about what the Goyim will say. That's not my issue. It's about us. And you don't want, there is a moral complexity to it. You don't want victimhood to be a moral allowance thing. You know, in our tradition, "Uschartem et hager ki gerim mi'item be'eretz Mitzrayim," you should remember the stranger because you are a stranger. In our tradition, the history of persecution is not, well, now that we are persecuted, nobody can have anything to say against us. It's actually heightening our own sensibility to the minorities that we now control. There is another sense that we have to be aware of. I'm talking about internalizing, we would say, the Declaration of Independence, which is not every political crisis is 39, 38. We have problems. There is the Iranian nuclear capability, there is that. Unfortunately, we lost the war against the Nazis. This is not the war we can keep on fighting. But we have the means of addressing other crises. So I think it's very important for us, handling power, to internalize the fact of power. In two realms. First of all, not to talk the language of the victim from a position of power. And second, managing a geopolitical world in which not every moment we are going to be extinguished. The Nazis are not all over there. We're not fighting Hitler. That's a war, unfortunately, we lost bitterly. So that's the first point. I want to make 3 points, short ones. The second point is, if I ask myself, what is the meaning of being a Jewish state? Israel is not only a state for Israelis. It means that we, as Israelis, have political responsibility for the fate of Jews wherever they are. And that means that whatever we do, we have to take into account world Jewry. So I don't know, if you are a deputy foreign minister, this is not a story I'm inventing. Our deputy foreign minister decides to humiliate the Turkish ambassador. There was such a thing, not a great moment of Israeli diplomacy, a moment. He has to think about Jews in Istanbul when he does it, as an Israeli official. It's our responsibility as Israelis to the Jewish people as a whole. Now the third point, and here I'll finish. I think, and that's the other side of the coin, I think anti-Semitism took a different form, turning to a certain degree into anti-Israeliness. And this is not by way of fending ourselves from any criticism. There is a way in which, and here there is a strange meeting between the radical right and the radical left anti-Semitism. You hear it both in Europe and other places. Israel has succeeded because it's part of a world conspiracy. How could it be that, I don't know, 4 million Israelis defeated the Arab countries around? There must be playing a world thing. And their very existence is just an affirmation of that horrible state of mind that it's kind of a secret cabal. You hear it also from the left European anti-Americanism that is another form of anti-Semitism. It's a very complex way. You talk to radical left people in Europe and they say, we are controlled by the United States. You ask us, what do you mean? And they tell you it's Hollywood and Wall Street, and usually you know what they mean. We know what they mean when they say that. So one thing we have to be aware of is that with the emergence of Jewish power, deep structures and forms of anti-Semitism that has so many faces have emerged to redescribe that fact within the old language. And hence comes delegitimation. I think BDS has deep elements of anti-Semitism in it. I'm saying it as an Israeli who actually comes from the left the Israeli left, more or less, left center. When I listen to the BDS language, so we have to be aware that there will be a kind of a shift of adapting the sort of traditional language of anti-Semitism to that fact of Jewish power. So this is a complex manner. One thing is, on our side, as Israelis, to internalize the fact of power. And what does it mean in terms of what Yehuda spoke as our responsibility? And the other thing is understanding that with it, anti-Semitism will take a completely different form. As Einat said, we haven't solved it, right? And the main thing, I've been involved in writing the IDF's military ethics code. And I always tell myself, soldiers, officers, others, our concern with acting, with raising to the challenge of power has nothing to do with what others will say about us. It's really our own sense of whom we want to be in the world and what we are. We have to remember that within a very complex environment of world opinion. So thank you for having me, and thank you.
So I want to relate a little bit to all of you. So first, referring to Einat, you mentioned, would Herzl have changed his mind? Well, it's a belief that once we become a nation like all other nations, anti-Semitism would disappear, and those of us who are not going to move to Palestine would assimilate in any case or convert, and that would solve the Jewish problem. Obviously, it hasn't worked that way. It just occurred to me that Herzl lived in Vienna at the same time that Freud lived in Vienna. And I was thinking that if Herzl would have met Freud, I would have said to Freud, Dr. Freud, I have a great idea. Freud would have said, and I have a good psychiatrist, you should come and see. I want to put this in a larger context. Not just the American context, but the world context, because talk was here about Jewish power, Israeli power for the most part, but also other kinds of power. And by the way, I don't accept the view that Jews prior to the State of Israel never had power. In fact, Jews very often used anti-Semitism as a vehicle for power, but that's another story. But my job is to be somewhat of a provocateur here. So I just finished a study, it's going to be published next month, on anti-Semitism in Europe. It's based on 16,000 telegrams and emails sent to the Israeli embassies in Berlin, in Bern, in Den Haag, in Stockholm, et cetera, et cetera. And these are emails, letters that were never intended to be public. We got our hands on it, my co-author and I. And here's what's interesting about those emails, and for the most part, 60% of these emails, these letters, these missives, did not come from the left or from the right, did not come from Muslims. 3% came from the extreme right, about 3% from the extreme left, and by the way, the arguments are almost the same, except in style. The majority came from what Germans call the Mittelstand, the society that is composed of professors, of priests, of lecturers, etc. And I think what these emails show is what's happening, and I think it's happening in America as well, it's happening on the American campuses as well, is what I would call the Israelization of anti-Semitism. Israel has become the foil. So if you look at any of these missives sent to all these embassies, almost all of them start with an anti-Israeli statement and immediately descend into the kind of anti-Semitism you would have heard in the 1930s and 40s. Amazing. I mean, I can read you, but we don't have the time. So here's the question. Is the fact that Israel is now a state that has power, obviously, what kind of influence does it have beyond Israel? And to maybe even sharpen this, is the fact that Israel does have power make anti-Semitism more potent? In other words, is it able to use the power that we have to turn it against us? How would you react to that?
Do you hear me? I've been playing around with this. Now? Okay. So again, my answer would be no. The actual fact of Israeli power is merely a convenient, perhaps, foil, like you said, but it doesn't change the root causes where the hatred comes from. It just gives it a remarkably respectable cloak, which is why you described people who supposedly come from respectable social circles are able to employ that, not feeling that they are thereby engaging in the low, dirty hatred of the lower classes. And that's also what we're seeing, that it has become a class thing, that anti-Zionism, hatred of Israel, has become a respectable cloak for hating Jews. It's what we see on campuses. And you also, I don't know if you saw it in those letters, those who engage in that hatred, virulent, you really feel it, will immediately take offense at any notion that they're anti-Semitic. They will immediately push it away and say, oh, we're not anti-Semitic, and then go on to say about the worst possible thing about Zionists. Zionists is okay, Israel, and only from that context. So it has become the respectable cloak, and one of the reasons that there's such a kind of pushback against it is that people don't want to let go of that respectable cloak. If you're putting them in the same basket with the deplorables, they don't want to be in that same place. They're professors, they're serious people, they're academics. They cannot be subject to that lowly impulse that does not belong to their kind. So in that sense, I think it still very much remains the same. But with your permission, I want to say something about powerlessness. What I've seen, it's always been a strain, you said, you're right, of Jewish thought. But there seems to be an increase in Jewish thinking, a certain attraction of the moral purity of powerlessness. Kind of saying, and you see it in some extreme forms of anti-Zionism. I recently heard it from the owner of Haaretz, that if it turns out that Israel cannot survive without controlling another people, then Israel has no right to exist. Zionism loses its moral justification. Now, I thought that was a very fascinating kind of moral set. Because if we are to engage in acts that are supposedly immoral, then the whole moral foundation for self-determination falls through. The notion that if Israel is not perfect, it loses its legitimacy. And you see it among many Jews. Jews live in America at a remarkable moment where their identity is considered a very desired identity. Literally, except for what we're seeing here and there, Jews are loved. Marrying Jews is a catch. This is a different world. And what you see among many Jews, especially young ones, is they enjoy this beautiful moral status in their society, and there's only one annoying thing. It's this big stain called Israel. So they begin to distance themselves from Israel, initially passively, kind of, look, I don't care about Israel, I don't want to talk about Israel, trying to protect their pristine Jewish identity, and increasingly, they do so by actively demonstrating that they and Israel, as to say, are not. But what they're going to discover one day is that no amount of pounds of flesh that they give away will ever be enough.
Even Norman Finkelstein, Chomsky, who dared mumble something against BDS for their insistence on the right of return, because even the Jews have the right to self-determination, were immediately called Zionist fascist pigs. And so it just shows you it's never enough. And this is what we have to say about what it really means to be a Jewish moral person. And I'll end with that. In a lot of societies and cultures, being moral comes from how much you disengage from life. You become a moral person when you don't eat, when you don't have sex, when you don't deal with money. When you disengage from life, you ascend as a moral person. Except at the margins, this has never been a major feature of Jewish life. Jewish morality emerges from the notion that you engage in life. You eat a lot. You have sex. You deal with money. You do it through a prescribed set of rules, but you engage in life. And morality emerges from the fact that you flex your moral muscle in dealing with life. And this is what Israel and Zionism have been to the Jewish people. As you said, it has been the greatest, broadest engagement with life. It's about fighting wars and terrorism and having a budget and having a just society and figuring out all these moral dilemmas in the context of Jewish history and civilization. And it's messy. It's not pristine. It's not beautiful. But you actually emerge more as a moral person when you engage and flex your moral muscle in real life than by distancing yourself from it. And that's the message we should have for Jews, and especially young Jews. You have a chance to be moral by living, not by disengaging. Thank you.
I think there's two caveats that I want to put in response to what you said, in terms of the original question of the way in which Israel changes the anti-Semitism conversation. And I do push back against the idea that Israel is merely a cloak on top of anti-Semitism for two reasons. First of all, we really, and I think this is a subject for another panel, but until we have a genuinely healthy public Jewish discourse that involves meaningful ways to criticize how Israel acts in the world, and instead we have a hyper-defensive culture that responds to criticism of Israel, you create a tremendous amount of tension, of ambient tension, of the slipperiness from criticizing Israel to being thought of as anti-Semitism. So that's number one. It's a really critical pedagogic caveat that our community needs to undertake, that you can't associate anti-Israelism with anti-Semitism so quickly if you haven't produced a meaningful culture of talking seriously about what criticism of Israel looks like. The second piece is that the narrative that you've been telling about Zionism is about a pursuit of normalcy. And what that lends itself to is the belief that, look, the Jewish people just wanted to be normal and pursued the creation of a normal state, and lo and behold, we create a normal state and we're not allowed to be normal. But that misses a huge feature of Zionist thought and what the State of Israel thought and thinks that it's doing, which has been a constant tension between the pursuit of normalcy and the pursuit of exceptionalism. And when you're also pursuing the idea of being exceptional, you're subjecting yourselves to a different level of criticism from the world community and a different level of tension that you create to other states and other peoples around the world when you're pursuing a moral and messianic vision for what a state is supposed to be. So to make the claim that merely, look, we tried to be normal, they don't like us, and that makes anti-Israelism a cloak of a classic anti-Semitism. Again, I'm not attributing anti-Semitism to the things that we do, but I'm claiming that we are interacting and we're transacting as Jews in the world based on a number of different moral pursuits, the pursuit of normalcy as well as the pursuit of exceptionalism. And if we don't take seriously that we're actually advancing these multiple moral pursuits, it becomes really hard to disentangle when we're being meaningfully criticized and when we're being hated. And that's part of, yeah, I'll stop there.
Let's start with the first question you raised. You say well, we're still getting all those emails, right? And the answer is, and what the fact of Israel changes? I mean, the answer is we can defend ourselves from those emails. We're not privy to the whims of those forces. And if they're going to try to hurt us, they're going to feel our might. It's a very simple fact, and it's the fact of Israel. But when we come to, so there is a way in which having that sense of capacity to engage frees you from the oy vey thing. Okay, so there are some emails, let them come. But there is another thing. And I must say, now from an Israeli perspective, I'm trying to think through those issues, shutting myself from the background noise of the world. At a certain point, we Israelis will have to decide, regardless of who said what about us, what people we want to be. And by the way, part of the luxuries of having power is the capacity to make those decisions. Among other things, are we destined to dominate another people? I hope not. I think it will be a very sad thing for us. By the way, part of having power is having the capacities to take risks in order not to dominate other people. Yes, we have the capacity to take risks. It's a very important thing. So the background noise is so strong here that it makes an honest discussion now in Israel about those issues really clear. But we all the time have to remember, at the end, it's not about, I'm sure, and I agree with Einat, even if we, I don't know, dismantle the state of Israel, those emails will keep going, right? In a different ways, because it's actually a plot. But we want to ask ourselves, what is it we want to be? And I think part of the fact of Jewish power is the capacity to ask this question and assume responsibility for what it means. And it's a great privilege. Our parents didn't have it. It's a great privilege.
So Moshe, I want to get back to your comments now. Your parents actually knew who they were. Right. They knew what they stood for. They had a sense of the tradition. I'm very concerned about what's happening on the campuses today. For many years, I've been involved on campuses. And so if we have power, right, supposed power, where have we gone wrong with the kids on campus? Why do our Jewish kids, for the most part, right, as Einat said, right, escape? Yeah, we know what we should be doing, but what haven't we done that we could have done?
So since I was exposed to that type of engagement in campus, I mean, those groups will always be there, I imagine, the anti-Semites, anti-Israeli mix, morally intimidate their environment. I'm talking about moral intimidation, including Jewish kids who know nothing, right? So here you are, and I'll tell you, teach your children some facts. Give them a strong capacity to address those issues. So you have a bunch of kids sitting there completely silent and basically morally intimidated. Now, this is something we're going to have to take care of. And it needs education, it needs learning, and it needs knowledge, because with knowledge comes security. And that's something that's going to have to be done. I'm not concerned about these groups. I'm concerned about the ways in which they morally intimidate their immediate environment, including some very nice, well-meaning Jewish kids. And what they don't have is any knowledge of what's going on. And you're going to have to deal with it, seriously, educationally, and letting them having a sense of pride in whom they are coming from deep understanding of history and reality and what the challenges are. That's what worries me.
Beyond our time, I see on the clock here. So we just scratched the surface. I think we need another panel at some other point to discuss with implications of what has been said here. I don't think we all agree with each other, Moshe, but we'll just continue this after the session. Sure. Thank you all very much for participating with us.